Thanks for tuning in for today's webinar on the ketogenic diet. We have a couple of announcements before we get things underway. We host several free webinars throughout the year, so be sure and visit our website to see a list of upcoming presentations. The next one will be next Thursday, March 7th, when Amanda Tammy presents a webinar on major meltdowns and factors contributing to emotional dysregulation in people with autism. You can learn more about that and our upcoming webinars by going to www.johnson-center.org, then clicking on the webinars link on the right-hand side. You can also join our email list there and stay up to date on all events and opportunities by clicking on the Join Our Email List link on the homepage. We also post news to our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter accounts, and these are great sites to stay up to date on news like scholarships, research news, and opportunities, events, and more. And you can check out the library of our past presentations on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Johnson Center. We currently have some terrific support programs, including support and sliding fee scales for diagnostic services, counseling support, and more. If you'd like more information, please contact us at info@johnson-center.org. Be sure to follow our colleagues at the Autism Research Institute, as they also host several great webinars and share some great resources on their website and social media pages. If you would like a certificate of attendance after today's webinar, look for a follow-up email in your mailbox 1 hour after the webinar concludes, or look for the link on our YouTube channel in the webinar description. It will contain instructions on how to get your certificate. If you have questions during the live webinar, please type them into your GoToWebinar control panel or email info@johnson-center.org. If you are watching a recording of this webinar, you may email questions to the presenter at info@johnson-center.org. Today's webinar is presented by our Clinical Director, Kelly Barnhill. Kelly is a certified clinical nutritionist with over 15 years of experience working with children with autism and related disorders. Kelly is also on the Science Advisory Board for the Autism Research Institute and has authored several research papers related to nutrition and autism. She is a sought-after presenter, speaking at several national and international conferences each year. We are happy to have her speaking here today, so without further delay, please welcome Kelly Barnhill.
Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. I'm happy to be here to talk about the ketogenic diet and autism spectrum disorders. I know it's a topic that has received a fairly significant amount of interest from the community at large and also from clinicians in recent years. And I hope that this series on ketogenic intervention is helpful to those across the community looking at this as a reasonable option in terms of treatment. So I'm here really to talk about the use of a ketogenic or a ketogenic-based diet across the board in a variety of different diagnoses and also autism spectrum disorder specifically. Whether you're a parent, a practitioner, a student, I hope that I can offer you a high-level view so that you get kind of a comprehensive perspective today on the use of the ketogenic diet historically and currently. So thank you for joining me. My goals are to provide you a history of what's called a classical ketogenic diet. Why are we still talking about this and how did we get here? I want to look at the research, current application, so modified or revised versions of the ketogenic diet. And I also want to look at other trends in both the scientific research and also the clinical application of this approach. And then I have some time for questions and discussion scheduled at the end of this talk. Ultimately, I want you to think about today's component of this series of talks as answering the why questions about the ketogenic diet and autism. So why would you think about beginning a ketogenic diet? Or why has it been used in the past? Why does it work? And next time, I'll be able to talk to you more about the hows of the ketogenic diet and the how-to, both from a dietary perspective, a clinical management perspective, and also a nutritional intervention perspective in terms of supplements specifically in the field of ketogenic approaches in ASD. So what is our ketogenic history? As a nutritionist by training and a practicing clinical nutritionist for almost 20 years, it's really important to me to fully understand the history of the application of a particular diet or food and nutrients in overall health. So we've known about the effects of ketosis specifically on the brain and in neurological concerns or neurological events for what's been thousands of years at this point. I mean, the research that's been published in the past clearly is minimal, but it is referenced in works of fairly well-known early medical writers from thousands of years ago. Many of you have likely seen this popular quote, "Let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food," by Hippocrates. It's become popular in lots of writings as we become more focused on preventative health management and preventative health care rather than disease treatment. Most of you have likely not heard about another writer, a Greek physician practicing and researching in early 300 BC. And that, for perspective on this, it's just after the times of Alexander the Great. But the focus that we didn't know about was that even then we were writing about treating neurological disease by removal of foods, and the importance on removal of food from a diet was just as important then as adding nutrient-dense foods in would be. And it was recommended that people fast without mercy or intake very limited rations for those with epilepsy, seizures, or what we call fits 200 years ago and 100 years ago then. So how did our knowledge evolve? Well, we're going to have to fast forward to the early 1900s, really, when a paper was published in a French medical journal in 1911 looking at the use of what evolved into a ketogenic diet, written by two physicians treating epilepsy. And the diet included many fats, low protein, and lower carbohydrates, but the ratios and the prescriptions were not exactly consistent with what evolved later, 20 or 30 years later, and what we even implement today. But that work was really interesting because they reported that in practice they treated a mix of 20 pediatric and adult patients, and and the results were overall inconsistent. So there were some people who did not respond at all, some people who had a fairly significant response, but overall there was a decrease in seizures for those who were participating. About 10 years later, a physician practicing in Ohio called Hugh Conklin did his research and published a theory and began in practice the recommendation of fasting for those with epilepsy. He wrote and believed that the issues associated with seizures and epilepsy were tied to problems in the gut, and really were coming full circle now because more and more of the research in the past decade is looking at the metabolome and the microbiome in the GI tract as a component and a concern in the efficacy of the ketogenic diet. He believed that something called Peyer's patches in the intestine indicated that the GI system needed bowel rest. He thought there was toxic overload. He believed that individuals, including children, should fast as long as they were physically able. And what that meant was it was prescribed on a case-by-case basis, and he monitored patients closely and documented results on a daily basis clinically. Ideally, he wrote that patients needed to fast for a minimum of 3.5 to 4 weeks on water only. And he claimed remission rates of up to 75% in the pediatric population and 50% of adults, which is huge. And this kind of reinforces the need to push the body into ketosis. And that's what this fasting does, really. It allows the body to begin to use ketones as a source of fuel rather than glucose, which is what our body and brain typically runs on when we're eating a typical diet. So here's just a clip from a time frame that was published real time in the 1920s, looking at his work on fasting and epilepsy. And the point that I wanted to bring out was that in 37 tests in which children were used as patients, only 2 were still affected by the disease, and that's what was called epilepsy or fits at the time. They were all under the age of 11 years or older. 11 years or under, but we affect cures in older patients from 50 to 60% as well. So I think, this work was done contemporaneously with development of the classical ketogenic diet, but I believe it's important to highlight and look at the work he was doing simultaneously with just fasting, because it speaks to a lot of our beliefs and understanding now of how the gut and brain interact, and the mechanism of action of this dietary intervention. So how did we get to the place of using what's now called the classical ketogenic diet? And let me take a few minutes and explain that terminology specifically before I really kind of jump into the history and explaining differences and different approaches. The ketogenic diet now is so popular. There are so many websites, so many authors out there with books and cookbooks, and we're using keto diet as kind of a catch-all for a bunch of different approaches. And the keto diet that you read about and hear about on trendy websites or popular websites is not the ketogenic diet that was medically initiated and has been tracked for about 100 years, almost 100 years really. There are nuances and differences that are really important to be aware of, so that you understand that one ketogenic diet is not another ketogenic diet, is not another ketogenic diet, and is certainly not a medically prescribed classical ketogenic diet. So I just want to make that clear as we move forward, because there are lots of differences that are subtle and not so subtle really in application and the need for medical involvement and clinical care in trialing any of these interventions that we talk about. So classical diet is based in the fasting approach that Conklin mentioned in his early work. It was developed in the 1920s. It depends on which researcher you write, which historian you focus on, but researchers at Mayo and Johns Hopkins and Harvard and the University of Rochester have all claimed to have developed the ketogenic approach. And I think there was a lot of concurrent work being done in this finite time frame. So the late, say 1918 through the 1920s on dietary intervention with a variety of different strict ketogenic approaches, but in these research institutions. And they all started publishing simultaneously on things that looked primarily the same, just a little bit different from each other. And it was thus regularly, when these papers started coming out, it was used fairly regularly to address epilepsy for 20 to 30 years. In that time frame, there weren't other options. So solid anti-epileptic drugs and other pharmaceuticals had not been developed yet. And this became the intervention, and above strict fasting as recommended by Conklin, keto became the way to treat unremitting seizures and significant seizure disorders and epilepsy. But the development of anticonvulsants in the 1930s and 1940s showed a marked decrease in this as dietary intervention as primary line of care for those with epilepsy. There were several institutions that continued to look at dietary change for a while, but with the really the advent of medical technology and the pharmaceutical ability to manage these things, dietary change was not believed to be the most appropriate frontline intervention for treating epilepsy. So now I want to talk a little bit about current application trends in the ketogenic diet. So we talked a bit about classical, and I want to give you some specific breakdowns on ratios of nutrients and what that approach looks like. But there are a bunch of other ones out there that we know about now, as I mentioned. So there's the classical approach that I'll cover. There are also a variety of different modified ketogenic diets, which are researched on and published about, including what's called the MCT oil ketogenic diet, and also the LGIT approach, which is a modified MCT oil ketogenic diet that looks very similar, but there are some differences there. There's also the modified Atkins diet in conjunction with that LGIT approach, which I mentioned, that's been looked at a little bit. And those are all very similar approaches, but they have some specific differences that I guess from a scientific and a data perspective, we need to be clear on. And the last thing that I want to talk about, and just briefly touch on it today, is the ketogenic diet for autism, which is a dairy-free ketogenic diet. That one has been published on as well, and I have some research I want to share with you at the end of this talk that goes through that. So in looking at a classical ketogenic diet premise, it's, I guess the focus is that, number one, as I mentioned, the body and the brain begin to use ketones rather than glucose as the form of energy to make things run. And that is, ketones are derived from fat intake, and glucose is primarily derived from carbohydrate. And the classical approach is very specific both on content of both of those macronutrients and also protein, and also ratios of those nutrients to each other. So a classical ketogenic diet requires that food be weighed and measured on a gram scale, ideally, because it needs to be that precise, or we thought so as this approach was developed and implemented over the past 50 years. It also requires that carbohydrate content be kept to a strict minimum. So no more than 20 grams a day of carbohydrates at all, and all carbohydrate exposure must be weighed and evaluated carefully. That includes all medication, meaning that you would need to understand any inactive ingredients in either liquid or capsule form for those supplements. It means that any liquid suspension, which is often a form of sugar, would need to be evaluated in terms of total carbohydrate intake. We need to look at toothpaste, anything at all that could increase total carbohydrate intake for the body would need to be taken into account in creating that appropriate intake and those ratios as well. Oops. So looking at dietary calculations, total energy intake needs to be determined by the child. For example, their growth, their ideal weight, and also their current intake of food. So from a clinical perspective, you need all that data when you're working with it as a practitioner or with a practitioner. That's data that you need to have available before you ever begin. And then when you start calculating what that intervention looks like, you look at either a 3-to-1 or a 4-to-1 ratio of fat to other macronutrients, depending on the clinician's recommendation, the clinical approach you're taking, clinical interpretation. So a clinician might use a 3-to-1 ratio with one individual and choose a 4-to-1 ratio with others. It really depends on the individualized needs of the patient and also the background knowledge and training of the individual implementing that diet. So the ratio is then determined by fat to combined protein and carbohydrate content. Often people believe that it's that fat carbohydrate ratio, and sometimes in some variations of keto it is. But from a classical perspective, that 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 ratio is created and calculated by fat to all other macronutrients. And the ratio is limited by the protein content, which is determined by the recommended daily allowance of the individual who fits the criteria listed below. So age, activity, growth, and ideal weight. Those things would then determine what the recommended RDA for protein intake for any given individual would be. So for a classical perspective, there is a lot of information that needs to be gathered and processed to create, I guess, the ideal approach for any individual. So just some background now in terms of, this is what our standard American diet looks like. I'm sure that you've seen this acronym SAD in looking at where our diet comes from, typically without any intervention or recommended change at all. So on average, and these also reference pediatric intake. So on average, protein accounts for 15 to 20% of our dietary intake. Carbohydrates account for 55 to 60% of our intake, and fat accounts for about a third, 25 to 30% of our total dietary intake. And that data is calculated across a number of different populations and has been replicated in several studies. So that's where this makeup comes from. And then in looking at a classical ketogenic approach, those ratios are shifted. So take a look now. Protein is typically held to about 6% of total intake. Carbohydrates are held to 4%, and fat becomes a huge component of our intake. And this is kind of what they look like together. So what does dietary initiation look like when you begin? One, for a classical approach, we still use inpatient care to induce ketosis. There are a number of reasons we do that, but it's primarily done because patients who are recommended and choose to follow a classical ketogenic approach are typically medically fragile. And that means that they have multiple unremitting seizures, they've failed to respond to other seizure meds, they have comorbid medical conditions that might put them at risk for additional concerns with a change in diet like this. It also allows for documentation of intervention for families, and it allows for training for parents. And that time frame, depending on the institution, these are typically done in tertiary care hospitals where diets can be followed and there's a long history of implementation. So that list of institutions that I mentioned earlier is a solid one. Johns Hopkins tends to do a lot of work around the ketogenic diet and derivatives. So they provide training for parents in this process, and offer a lot of support once discharge occurs as well. It can be a 4 to 7 day stay typically, depending on the protocol for implementation. Medical management of blood sugar for these patients is important, and ketone levels is important, and that can be done very easily in the hospital, and then knowledge can be transferred to parents for home care as well. And discharge really occurs when the child is stable, tolerating the food, and is comfortable, the family's comfortable leaving inpatient care to follow through with the diet at home. And why, I guess, other things you need to think about, and many of these are strictly for those who are following a classical approach, but several occur with the implementation of other forms of the ketogenic diet. Why would we be watching for side effects? Well, there are, if you look at the top half, really, those are things that likely could be managed at home. So all of these GI issues, vomiting, diarrhea, reflux, gastrointestinal discomfort, dehydration if a child is refusing food. Those can be managed at home, but the ones that we're looking for and that we need medical oversight for with initiation are things like kidney stones, which can occur in a small percentage of kids who begin the ketogenic diet, ketoacidosis, in excess ketosis, so going into ketosis and then ketoacidosis, which can be life-threatening, and nutritional deficiencies that can develop over time if it's not managed well. Just as an aside, there's some recent work that's been published on the development of scurvy in a couple of patients who were following a non-classical ketogenic diet, so an outpatient implemented ketogenic approach that had been followed for not an extended period, not years, but for a shortened period of time, with the development of severe scurvy. So all of these things really are things that we look out for and watch for, whether we're inpatient or outpatient in a ketogenic intervention. So the next thing I want to talk about really is pros and cons of beginning this diet. It works for many kids. If you look at the data, it can be highly successful in providing a significant decrease in seizures. It can be a healthy diet when it's applied correctly, through the overall evaluation at baseline, through consistent nutrient-dense food support, any nutritional supplements that are needed. Medication dosages and usage can be changed dramatically, which reduces the side effects from those medications, which for many kids include lethargy and other fairly significant concerns that can be tracked to long-term use of an anti-seizure drug. The harder parts, and I see these as being barriers rather than cons, it's a really strict approach, and ratios are important. You can't deviate from this and expect the results. Compliance is really strong here, and many families find that the burden that it places on them and their child, their patient, is too great to remain consistently in a ketogenic approach. And you really need to go a minimum of 90 to 120 days before the effect of the diet can be accurately assessed in terms of seizure management. There might be a sudden decrease as the body adjusts to this ketosis state, and then the baseline might change a little bit. And having that window of time to evaluate whether it's going to make a difference and if that difference is sustainable is important, I think. So in terms of the effectiveness, which I just touched on briefly, about a third of the patients discontinue the diet due to lack of compliance, lack of tolerance, or lack of efficacy. And when I say tolerance, that either means, in the literature, food refusal, so they just never become comfortable eating the foods that are required to maintain a ketogenic approach, or the GI upset and distress is too great to continue and they can never physically tolerate the intake of ketogenic food. A third of their patients experience 50 to 90% decrease in seizure activity. That's a very significant number, and on a clinical basis, looking at a family who's had, unremitting seizures for years, that can make a substantial change in the child and the family's life. And of those patients, a third of them have a greater than 90% reduction in their activity, and 50% of those patients become seizure-free. So it has a profound impact when it's done correctly. The downside is there's a clinical bias towards pharmaceutical intervention above dietary intervention, simply because it's perceived as too hard. And you can't lie and say this is easy to do in the context of our culture or in the context of a family or a community, but it can be done. And if we focus on food as the medicine and food as the intervention and frame it in a way that we know it's best for our child's development, we can be successful. So the next thing I want to talk about is a modified ketogenic diet. And I use this globally, though there are many modified keto diets. The one that I'm speaking about specifically was developed in the early 1970s. And it simply meant that MCT oil, which is also a big popular item now, is added to a traditional ketogenic diet to bolster fat intake. MCT oil is typically more easily digested. It bypasses one function of that process and is more easily absorbed. And therefore, it induces ketosis and provides fuel for the body and the brain more quickly than other items used in a classical keto approach. The other interesting thing is that by increasing fat intake through the use of MCT oil, you allow for more carbohydrate intake in most instances. Again, some clinicians and practitioners use that MCT oil to increase the total fat intake, which then allows you to increase total carbohydrate intake. Others use that MCT oil to get to that ratio and necessary need of total fat intake for the day. So depending on the clinician, depending on their training, depending on their philosophy in that approach, that could look a little bit different. So one specific modified keto approach is the LGIT approach. In both of these, so a generalized keto, modified keto, and an LGIT approach, 60% of the diet is derived from the MCT oil, and that's the fat. It's not ratio dependent as a classical keto. It's also this low glycemic index approach developed in the early 2000s, incorporating our knowledge nutritionally of the glycemic index to further refine a ketogenic protocol. It brings in and relies on complex carbohydrates with a low glycemic index to have an impact on insulin levels, and it's another layer of knowledge and information that helps us refine what a prescribed diet might look like. So what does a nutrient content of a modified keto look like? Protein is 20 to 30% of total intake. Carbohydrate is limited to 40 to 60 grams, but it all must be lower than 50 on the glycemic index. So that changes that recommendation fairly significantly for from a traditional ketogenic approach, and fat is again 60% of dietary intake. So what are the risk benefits here? They include one, you can modify this approach somewhat and still, in the research, as it bears out anyway, get the same results as a classical approach. There are fewer supplements necessary, and therefore there's less monitoring both of laboratory work from a clinical perspective and also the impact on the family in terms of getting the supplements in and also purchasing them decreases. However, the downsides to be aware of in approaching a modified ketogenic diet are there is an interaction with this high level of MCT oil with valproate, which is a drug that's used fairly commonly in seizure management, and that needs to be addressed if you're going to use the MCT oil component specifically to increase fat intake. There is an expense, and it's important, as always, to work with a trained clinician. In the US, it's not typically applied or recommended in terms of added MCT to manage fat intake. But outside the US, the expense for that extra MCT oil is covered by nationalized healthcare or other programs that we don't have access to here. And if we private pay for that here in the United States, it becomes quite expensive quite quickly to get to the levels of intake we need. Given the palatability of a modified ketogenic, it's easier on the patient to be compliant. There are more options in terms of dietary intake, and it's an encouraging scenario. But the hard part is to remember the use of the MCT oil as a supplement, and think about what that looks like both in terms of lifestyle and cost in terms of the intervention. And we'll go through all of that specifically and what that looks like in part 2 of this webinar. I just wanted to bring that up right now. Another diet that kind of falls in this area is the modified Atkins diet. We all know about the Atkins diet, and this is a specific version of that developed out of Johns Hopkins, has been researched and used at Cornell Columbia, and it models more after a keto rather than an Atkins in some respects, because it isn't a high protein diet like an Atkins is, but it is a higher fat like a ketogenic diet. So it's truly another form of a modified keto. Almost 30 studies are out there now, including 400 to 500, both pediatric and adult individuals have looked at this diet. And in general, just like a modified keto or a low glycemic index, it's positive and the outcomes are similar to a classical ketogenic diet or a modified ketogenic diet, but it's easier to follow and it's better physically tolerated. So again, all of these diets are very similar. They have a lot of things in common, but they're slightly different choices in components, in fat need, in fat supplementation, carbohydrate components, and the ratios of those macronutrients to each other. So what does a modified or a MAD diet look like? Outpatient initiation versus inpatient support. Fasting isn't a component necessarily. We still often use fasting in inpatient implementation of a ketogenic diet, but we're trending toward not doing so now. There really aren't any calorie or fluid restrictions in terms of intake for patients prescribed this diet. There's no weighing or measuring of that food, so precision is not the key really. The more important thing is limited carbohydrates and the ratio of those over time. There are no specific or required meal plans to begin, and carbohydrate restriction seems to be the most important component with initiation. Another plus really for the Atkins diet is that in looking at overall supplementation needs to do this well, a multivitamin and calcium are recommended for Atkins, and there are other things that are crucial if we're decreasing carbohydrate intake beyond that, and are important components of other modified ketogenic and ketogenic diets. So this is kind of what the modified Atkins diet looks like, and with that same comparison that I gave you earlier. This chart, I think, is a nice summary of both developments. So it kind of gives you the chronological development of these diets that we've discussed, and also a nice way to visualize what you need to do to be able and be successful in implementing these diets. So after all that, what are my tips and takeaways for you as you think about ketogenic diet and perhaps its relevance to treatment or intervention for either a patient or a family member? Number one, the ketogenic approaches are not new. We've known about this for a long time, and we've researched and published on it for a significant period of time now, with a gap based on development in the pharmaceutical industry. But overall, it's been around for a while, and it's not newly recommended information. It's validated in the research literature for seizure treatment, and there's more and more being written about it in autism literature. Other things that are important for you to remember are that regardless of which path is taken, and you look through this history and then you hear about what's happening in autism, regardless of which path that you want to take, it's important to have medical and clinical management. So for a number of reasons, you need a professional's eyes on what you're doing. This is not a read a website on the internet or buy a book and start it for a child with a neurological concern. It's dangerous that information is out there right now, because it's one thing to be a healthy 50-year-old male implementing this for weight loss, and it's another thing entirely to implement this diet for an 8-year-old child with autism and other concerns that are, health related. So I caution you to think it's something that you can teach yourself to do with some kind of prescribed roadmap, because it's harder and more complex than that, and there are things to look out for along the path. All of these interventions can have medical consequences that can be severe. So I mentioned the kidney stones. There are ketoacidosis is an issue. Onset of seizures and a different type of seizures can be significant. Wild variability in blood sugar can occur, and some metabolic disorders. So all of those reasons, when you begin something like this, it's good to have a resource and a set of eyes to help you. Okay, now I want to spend a little bit of time looking at the research that's out there right now on use of the ketogenic diet in autism. And there isn't much, but I want to highlight it for you so that you have information to share with practitioners, whether in a research group that you're in or with your pediatrician for your own child. So you have some resources to understand and support decisions that you might either recommend or choose to follow utilizing a ketogenic diet. So about 4 years ago now, there was a review paper published looking at this as more and more families attempted a ketogenic diet for their children with autism who did not have seizures as well. So families were seeing positive response in the autism community for children who had seizures, and families were noting and reporting that, hey, in addition to seizure management and control, they were also seeing some behavioral gains through the implementation of the ketogenic diet. And so a couple of researchers set out to take a look at this and look at the research that had been published to date, and they looked at 8 research studies, which included 5 human studies. The first one that you see there tracked 30 children looking at behavioral improvement on an accepted instrument. It was a pilot study. They enrolled 30 kids. It noted behavioral improvement across the board for the kids who've completed the study. So 18 children completed the study. 12 of them were removed. 7 of them were removed because they could not tolerate the high fat component, so that physical inability to tolerate an increased fat intake. And 5 others followed the diet for a minimum of 60 days, but dropped out before the 6-month completion of the study. So the study was implemented in a 4-week on, 2-week off profile. So they followed a diet strictly for 4 weeks, and then they took a 2-week break, and then they went back to the diet, and they tracked these behavioral changes across that time. And of those 18 children who finished, all of them noted some type of improvement. 8 reported mild, 8 reported moderate, and 2 noted significant behavioral improvement as documented on the CARS rating scale. That's a 60% improvement for every child that was enrolled and 100% improvement for every child who completed the study. The second study that you see there is a parent survey looking at all interventions, nutritional interventions, dietary interventions for children with autism. So Richard Fry and colleagues surveyed parents to look at a huge array of intervention, and parents reported that their perception was that there was much better seizure control in a ketogenic diet than a GFCF diet. That study did not look at ketogenic diet behaviorally for kids without seizures. It didn't report on that in any case, but it did report that families who had comorbid seizures reported an increase in seizure control over other dietary changes. That third study you see there is important for me to include because if you notice, it was another pilot study, but they had 16 people enrolled and only 6 participants could accept and tolerate the intervention, and one of those 6 showed improvement on the same scale that was used in the first study at the top of the page. So inconsistent findings, I guess, between these 2 studies, and I want to point that out because we don't have a consistent message coming through in the literature that's been published to date. These 2 are case studies that were published that were included in that, and they're both tracking improvement in one individual child. The first, you'll see, used a GFCF ketogenic diet, and it talks about improvement in cognitive, language, social skills, and IQ, also behavior. The second talks about reduction in seizure frequency. So that was really the kind of the summary of the work to date 4 years ago. And since that time, there's been a good number of papers published looking at both the bench science, so what's happening in animal models, and also in children with autism specifically. Here's one of them that I wanted to point out because it was a well-designed study that showed good results. It was published last summer. It looked at a 12-week trial, again, pilot study. 15 children were able to complete the study, and it noted significant improvement in all core autism features per the ADOS-2, and significant improvement in fear or nervousness, body use, and imitation on the CARS scale that I mentioned earlier. I think these researchers are following on with some additional work, and this study looked at the MCT oil enhanced keto for kids. Sometimes people ask now also about, so what's the mechanism of action here on the ketogenic diet? And because the GI component has been studied somewhat, though not in its entirety in autism, we know there's some GI component in terms of health for kids on the spectrum, and we're starting to look at how a ketogenic diet affects the gut, and also look at that in autism specifically. And this study at the top was published a few years ago, and that's it was a fairly comprehensive thought process on looking at what's happening in the microbiome level in autism with application of a ketogenic diet. And that's a very good resource to look at when you're thinking about having a discussion with colleagues or with your physicians on why you might try this for your child. The second is an animal model paper that was published a few years back. And the third is looking at impact on the microbiome in infants with epilepsy. So I wanted to run through all of that research kind of quickly, and I realize I'm running out of time now, and I apologize, but I really wanted to get to this stopping point beyond the research, beyond the history, so you kind of understand the whys of why we think about doing this and how to formulate a rationale for a conversation on why you think it's a reasonable approach and a reasonable intervention. So thank you for bearing with me through that, and thank you for kind of giving me the opportunity to share that background with you before we talk about the specifics of what to do. And I have time for a few questions right now, and I've seen lots coming in, so let's see. I have several questions that are similar to what foods do I eat? What foods can I serve my child? Is there a dietary yes list? And the answer is I'll cover all that in the next webinar, which is scheduled for 2 weeks from today, I believe. I think it's March 14th. There's a link to it on this slide here. And that's really where I want to spend more time talking about the what's rather than the why's. How should I measure impact? That's a really good question. So if you choose to do a ketogenic diet and you have some guidance from a clinician on which approach you want to try, there are baseline measures that you can get early on so that you can look at the data from a lab. You can look at behavioral data if you have behavioral therapists involved. There are baseline screeners that you can find to use to track it informally. The ATEC, which is published by ARI and found on the website, is available kind of as an informal tool that you can follow out and check on it just to see on an ongoing basis what kind of change you might see there. My child just started a new med. When should we start the diet? Number one, it depends on the med. So that would depend on what is the ideal length of time to note change on that specific intervention. So my clinical recommendation would be find out what that period of time is to note change for that intervention, and then give yourself a buffer of time as well, which could be a month or so, to really be able to separate and identify positive change or negative impact of those two separate interventions. My child doesn't have seizures. What's the profile of a child you would consider the diet for? You know, this is such an emerging area that we don't have a clear profile of a child that would or would not work for, because there's no research data out there or even clinical documentation to guide us. But in general, I would say kids who have been responders in some respect to another dietary intervention, kids who have ongoing GI concerns, kids who you have the ability to, you evaluate it and you have the ability to help them be successful given the additional layer of complication in your and their lives. All of those things I think are considerations for beginning a ketogenic intervention. What else? What about gluten and casein-free diet status? If you noticed, I mentioned that one of those case studies looked at a gluten and casein-free ketogenic diet. It's possible, absolutely, to do a dairy-free ketogenic diet. A ketogenic diet, as classically introduced, wouldn't have a huge gluten component anyway, but it would have a huge dairy component, and those things can be tweaked so that you can follow an appropriate diet to those ratios that I mentioned, that is also gluten-free and casein-free. Another question, my son has never taken to meats, and my question is, being on a GFCF diet and being mainly vegetarian, how successful would it be for him? So I'll speak to the success of the implementation of the diet, and that would be, it'd be entirely appropriate to start a gluten and casein-free vegetarian, primarily vegetarian approach, and be successful in using the ketogenic diet. I've noticed prepared and packaged meals. Are these safe and can we use them? The answer is yes. There's a lot more out there now. Some things are better than others, clearly, but because this has become a popular intervention, there are more and more things that are readily available for us to use on a limited or not so limited basis in terms of prepared goods. So there are some bars that are good, there are some powders that are good, that allow us to make it an easier transition than it has been in the past to a ketogenic approach. And last question, though there are a lot more here, I'll try to touch on the other ones when we speak next time. What about supplements? And there's a whole section that I want to walk through on supplements because yes to supplements. In my opinion, supplements are required for any version of these diets that you choose. And I think it's really important to note that. Of course, my bias is I believe in nutrition and I believe in the value of being therapeutically supplemented in some respects, and that informs my choices with how I support families. But I like to be extremely cautious in starting such a significant diet and lifestyle change. And part of that for me is confirming without a doubt that I've covered any possible deficiency or concern that I might be creating by recommending that approach. So thank you so much for your time and your attention. And if you have other questions, you're welcome to email them now. You can send them in through GoToWebinar. We'll compile those and I can add those to the list for our Q&A associated with the next webinar. If you have questions that I didn't get to this time that are specific to the information presented here, if you email them to info@johnson-center.org or kbarnhill@johnson-center.org, I'm happy to speak to those privately as well. Thank you so much. I think 2 weeks from today. Okay, I have a conference call now. On to the next thing.